thank you very much, Rachel, for that introduction, and thank you for my esteemed panel joining me here today. And what you said is such a hot topic out there, given COP27 last week. Sorry, try not to lose my voice. So I wanted to get stuck in because we've heard, as you said, those comments on COP, but we've also had some pretty major macro economists out here this morning talking about their view of the world. And just before lunch, we were hearing from Nouriel talking about a hard landing. And so I just wanted to bring it to the panel, challenges for the green energy transition. There seems to be this tug of war between a major economic slowdown, this possible hard landing that Nouriel was talking to, and the major disruption to energy supplies given the war in Ukraine. This tug of war about investing in green energy, one pulling back, one maybe pushing forward the need for alternative energy. What's your view on that at the moment, and perhaps the erosion of political will to get stuff done? If I could start with you first, Amit.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in terms of green energy, there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. One is the traditional fossil fuel versus non-fossil fuel. And of course, there's never a question of moving from one to the other in one sweet step. We often talk about, as a result, natural gas being a transition fuel. So I think there's understanding around that, but more and more, I think, how green is the question. For example, things like solar panels, considered very green in the operation side of things, but as we get to the realization that the whole life cycle of a solar panel, including the building of it, but at the tail end, once you are looking at 20, 25 years, you have to dispose those off. That's not as green as we would like it to be. So I think those are the kinds of discussions that we're getting into right now. The nitty-gritty, the details, and at least from my perspective, we're talking to institutional investors, primarily the pension funds in the United States, folks like BlackRock and others. They are more interested in those kinds of details and then defining where green energy is and where we want to put the finances in. Politically, I think, again, in the United States, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA, there has been a lot of momentum, and there's a focus towards public monies being there, rules, regulations, benchmarks being there, but clearly there's an opportunity for the private sector to jump in.
Yeah, you've touched on a lot of big themes there that we'll pick up on. Arnaud, if I could take it to you to go back to that macro level for now. What are you thinking about when you look at the challenges? I know, again, in Lombard Odier, you'll be looking at various parts, but how are you seeing this tug of war and how is it playing out for your investors?
We are definitely at a critical point. And of course, on one hand, as you referred to the war in Ukraine just earlier, a number of countries are obviously facing a very hard situations, and when you have to question, your future about feeding basically your population or going back to coal, as we have seen some European countries doing, of course you may think that is definitely postponing, the priorities in terms of climate change. On the other hand, I think there is good reasons too to see it as an accelerating factor of the transition. Because we can see that some countries are also investing much bigger amounts into the transition than they probably wanted to initially. They probably had forgotten the old, grandmother, principle of don't put your eggs in the same basket and basically not have all your energy resources coming from just one single source, which sounds like common sense, but that did not happen, as we all know. So that is definitely changing. And when you see that as much as solar and wind typically energies are falling to parity to fossil fuels, as an example, that is definitely accelerating this solution. We see also that in 2030, the solar situation, the solar panels and energy is going to multiply by sixfold, okay, roughly. So that's that is very much accelerating and booming. However, it is true that there is currently a momentum, that there is a pause, probably, which is not welcome, but I think that's the big change that we have seen in comparison to a couple of years ago, is that it's not, are we here to move, okay, should we move or not, is now just how fast do we move? And we see that potentially as an acceleration.
I can see Chiamaka nodding away there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what he'd said. I think that the question around transition is, the conundrum really is a practical one, because it's really a question of, we want to have ambitious plans, but practically, can we actually meet some of the targets? So, for instance, if you think about some of the issues, and this is just the first example that comes to mind, I'm not picking on the particular state, but California in the US is supposed to be one of the leading states in the region around green energy. And they've come out with all these ambitious targets around climate, including, for instance, having a fully green state grid by 2035. At the same time, they almost had blackouts and had to state of declare an emergency just over the summer because as a result of the heat wave, the demand for power soared immeasurably to unprecedented levels, and they just couldn't keep up. So I don't think we can afford to be purist in our approach to the transition. I think we have to be ambitious, but we also have to be practical. And this actually is where the opportunity is for the private sector as well, because the other end of this is around how do we get together collectively towards mass adoption.
Yeah, and Zia, I want to bring you in on this because, we were chatting beforehand and you said, it's really hard to know in this investment environment which way to go. We've had esteemed macroeconomists here this morning telling us how hard it could be or not, as the case may be. So from your perspective as director of those investment partnerships at APICORP, how are you seeing the landscape and those challenges out there?
No, thank you, Sarah. I think what we were discussing was standing today, but we have been facing we invest both in hydrocarbon and green, by the way. And for the last 5 or 7 years, we elected to started nibbling in green energy. So we looked at a lot of assets. We managed to get, I'm using managed because what I'm about to say later, managed to get a stake in a distributed solar company and a wind farm. But most of the opportunities that came across, which we assessed, they were not rightly priced in the sense they were very expensive. There was a lot of money chasing green assets over the last 4 or 5 years without naming a country. We looked at a fairly large portfolio of assets in a country where the premium over the sovereign yield was only 2%. Now, 2% is not a price you pay for a commercial risk in a country. And the other points which probably would happen in the next year or so are the contractual ones. A lot of structures, both PPA structures and the capital structures, have been extremely aggressive over the last 4 or 5 years. When I say fine, they say inflation is adjusted, but we don't know what is the relationship between inflation and interest rate. A lot of transactions were done on an EBL basis or refinancing on a mini-perm basis. Now, when the time comes for refinancing, whether the equity guys would get the refinancing or not. So going forward, I believe that, and a lot of investors who never invested in green energy, I'm not saying whether they had the capabilities or not, but then they also invested in green energy. So I assume that a lot of these assets would finally come to the market in a year or so. And standing today, what makes me awake at night are so many things. There's so many things happening. Inflation, interest rate, FX, flight of capital from emerging market to the so-called heavens of safety. So I think going forward, I think the problems will still remain the same.
Yeah, and let's make it more of a problem because it's time, as we were alluding to in the introduction there, and we heard from the first speaker this morning, time is running out, and I know that, Amit, you are nodding away about that. Some people are saying they're going to miss the target. Some people, when I was in COP last week, were saying, this target is not ambitious enough, and because it's not ambitious enough, we're not pushing so hard. It's still not on some corporate agendas. It is in a tick-boxy way, but not in a real way where we're starting to see that allocation of capital.
Yeah, and I think recognizing that, I think in the next few years we're going to see increased pressure, let's say from the political system, from the regulatory side of things. So as a result, I think there's going to be more and more attention on greening portfolios. So there's both the opportunity, as was just discussed, but I think there is an increased pressure to go beyond just the low-hanging fruits, as it were. And this is where I think there is got to be a mix of sort of non-green assets, because we got to recognize that if we cannot meet the needs of providing increased access, for example, in the developing world, which is still the big story. You cannot just get there with greening everything. So you can be as aggressive as you want to be with green energy, but there's still going to be a lot of emphasis on fossil fuel-based energy generation. So the balance of where the market leads us there, in addition to the pressures that we see from the regulatory and policy side of things, that's all in the mix, along with all of the macroeconomic issues, inflation, wars, etc. But clearly, that's an issue. And I think in a lot of instances, what I'm seeing is that there is an increased emphasis from grid-based energy to off-grid and mini-grid solutions. A lot of it has to do with the fact that our transmission systems are not geared up towards many of the green energy flows, and also because of the very nature of energy demand, there is a lot of scope for, as I said, the mini-grid, off-grid solutions, not just in the developing world, which is where we see it the most, but also in the United States, for example, to overcome some of these inherent structural problems in the near term.
And Chiamaka, I want to bring you in on this in the sense that you kind of alluded to it there, the simplification of this discussion on the transition, stop oil, let's have greening. Of course, the very word transition underlines what needs to happen here. But in all of that, it's squashed between political cycles, it's squashed between changes in government regulation, and yet the private sector partnerships are also necessary, and you were saying to me beforehand, they need to do some pretty heavy lifting, the private sector, in this discussion.
Yeah, no, the private sector, I mean, all the stakeholders have a part to play, the public sector, the private sector, civil society, but I do think that there is an element of pass the parcel that we're finding where the public sector is pointing out the private sector and the private sector is blaming the public sector. So whilst I agree with a lot of the issues, some of them which my colleagues here highlighted, I actually think that some of the developments that we're seeing from a private sector perspective are really interesting. I think the growth that we've seen in green products, the innovation we've seen around structuring for sustainability-linked bonds, sustainability-linked loans, and I know the risks around greenwashing for these products, but I think these developments are part of the journey and actually a positive thing, because I think they show innovation, they show creativity. I mean, just to give you some numbers, the sustainability-linked bond market, for instance, and the loan market, the bond market in 2020 was about 9 billion, and 2021 was 100 billion. That's more than 10 times. And this is important because there will always be teething issues, but I think people need to recognize that you need scale to influence policy. And we're now at a point where the regulators are paying attention because people recognize that we need to fix some of the issues and some of the challenges around structuring for measuring impact, reporting for impacts, etc. But it's because of the scale that the industry is evolving towards that we're able to push for more urgency around this conversation. And like I was saying earlier, and Arnaud was speaking to pace, there has to be a sense of urgency, but at the same time, we can't sit back and wait from a private sector perspective. We kind of have to move and get creative around how we structure our transactions to make sure that we're incentivizing green and sustainable outcomes, and also penalizing when this is not happening.
Yeah, so like you say, there's this pincer movement going forward between innovation and regulation, because we've seen what happens when regulation falls off the bus. We won't mention the word, but this regulation is struggling to keep up with some of these new products, and yet it mustn't be pushed to the side for obvious reasons. Arnaud, I want to bring you in on that. I mean, you've got the investors at Lombard Odier holding your toes to the fire. You've got to make the investment returns for them. You've got to make sure those portfolios work. But at the same time now, they are holding you more to account, or they would like to know more transparency about the greenness, shall we say, of those investments. So how are you handling that at Lombard Odier?
Few elements in what you're saying. First of all, the pressure, especially from Europe, typically, from the regulatory standpoint, is very heavy on all companies and on the banks, okay, to work in this direction, probably more than the US at this stage as we speak. There is, you see, if today investors want performance, they just don't want, nice things, of course, at the same time. And we have conducted a survey in the region here where more than 70% of the high net worth in the region are taking and want to take into consideration climate change, ESG, and these principles in their investments, which, by the way, are not far from Islamic finance principles, okay? So that makes perfect sense. However, if today you want to invest in a number of companies which are already green, okay, to avoid the greenwashing, actually, if you really look into it, there are not so many, as we were discussing, as a matter of fact. So probably it's more vital, to measure the temperature trajectory of a company, okay, the transition. This is exactly what we're doing at Lombard Odier, or trying to at least. What we have built is an instrument which basically for each company will give the temperature or the level of temperature of a company. Say, for instance, with a breaking point between 1.5 degrees of the Paris Accord, does this company, according to its investments, its policies, and not just ESG, because ESG is a lot about policies, but I'm talking about balance sheet, investment, CapEx, have they taken the direction to reach this 1.5 degree target or not? Okay, and we have built, with a quant people from our side and also from Oxford University, a table that basically will show, or shows already, it's working, each line in your portfolio. So in other words, one can determine, is 20% of my portfolio within or above, whatever that is, the Paris Accord, and basically to measure the temperature of your portfolio and to make sure that at least you are aligned or less aligned, but talking essentially of companies which are transitioning once again. There are many things which are happening, and some have taken the steps already to make it quick, big, and fast, but it's not ready yet. But frankly, for the climate change, that's what you have to take into consideration, not just exactly what's happening just today, because that's not enough to invest in. And again, clients want performance at the end of the day. And we truly believe that those, eagles, as we call them, those leaders will definitely be performing more and better short-term, mid-term, and longer term than the laggers. That's definitely a conviction that we have.
And Zia, I want to bring you in on that, nodding away. This is very much your space, as you say, investments and partnerships in this area. Are you seeing the same thing? Rather than this old-fashioned view of, you either invest green or you get returns, that there's a coming together in this space. Number one, reputationally, you can't afford not to be doing that. But secondly, that dichotomy doesn't need to be there.
Sarah, what I believe in is that this is a typical case of externality, which is of global significance, in the sense somebody burning fuel somewhere has an effect on somebody living thousands of miles away. That's point number one. Second is, you can't go to that person and say, listen, don't do this anymore, because that's his life or that's her life. She has to do that. But you have to provide a solution. Like one of the stake we have taken in a distributed solar company, what we are trying to do is to provide a solution. We are assessing a number of transactions in sub-Saharan Africa, where you go and tell a person, listen, you can't say don't do this. You say, listen, we have a solar solution. You have to pay this much. I met a gentleman, he was working in the US of Nepalese origin. He went to Nepal and he set up a mini grid in one of the hills area, and the electricity he was supplying, or he is supplying, is almost 10 times of what Nepal government is supplying, but it makes a lot of sense to people there. They can do the handicraft and all the stuff they want to do till late in the night. So if it's a global problem, it has to be a global solution. You have to provide solution to people rather than saying, don't do this and it's going to harm us. I don't see anything on a global level, a body which is trying to say, let's subsidize, or let's put up so much of money for these emerging markets. I'm sorry to say, it's more of talk, but less of real action where it's really needed.
And it was really interesting. I was party to a conversation, and it was shared out afterwards with His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz last week. And he was saying that the way that we have those conversations with emerging markets in terms of their ability to deal with the climate change needs to change. It needs to be less condescending, was his words. And I want to bring that to you, Amit, this just transition. We had this announcement from COP27 on Sunday morning. Some describe it as disappointing, but at least now there's the seeds of a fund there to make up for the damage that's been done. Do we have any reasons to be cheerful? And what can you see in this move, not just transition, but the just transition for the emerging markets as well?
Well, it was 30 years in the making, so I think the fact that we have something formalized, that's worth celebrating, but I would take pause there because we still have a lot of details in terms of what the structure looks like. And let's face it, there's no commitment to monies. And given our global sort of shortcoming in that area, between a commitment being made and actual funding flowing from essentially government and multilateral sources, the track record is rather poor. So I think in this instance, I would definitely say that there is a huge role for the market and the ability for the market to follow the signals and do it appropriately, and perhaps not always reaching the 1.5, but getting to a stage where we're on track. I think that's the hopeful part of it. If we just leave it to government entities or multilateral entities, I feel that we're not going to get there. Back to the just transition, I think that's something that's becoming more and more relevant, not just in the developing world, but even in the United States. I think lots of pressure coming from communities, those that are traditionally marginalized. Just talk about transition. What do we mean by adding the just part of it in there? If you're transitioning away from a fossil fuel facility, you want to close it down, you're losing unionized jobs, communities are being impacted, the tax bases are being lost. How do you then account for that? And you move to, let's say, wind power, you're moving to contract jobs. Every 90 days, you're moving from one installation to the other. So there's a lot of worker disruptions, and you can't train everyone. So how do you, because there just aren't that many jobs moving from fossil fuel to the renewables. So how do we handle all of this transition? Perhaps even talk about something that says some of the folks that are at a certain age and above need to be given a nice retirement package because that's just. And, of course, the story goes on and on in terms of mining. We move from, coal mining to rare earth minerals and others like that. So I think that is a bigger conversation, perhaps gets into the idea.
social impact,
It's a social impact, externality, and investors actually have a lot of role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to be really unfair and give you just about a minute each, because we've got a whole room of investors here. They're looking at the very big topic of investing in green energy. So can I get you to all give us a minute each of what you think in the next 5 years, say, is the area that people should be really focusing on? And maybe, Chi, I'll start with you first. Ladies first. Where should we, for a 5-year investment horizon, what we should be investing in?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. We at Delphos, we're particularly seeing a lot of opportunity in the sustainability-linked space, so the transition space, as opposed to purely the green space. But I do think that there are also very attractive opportunities in the green space. We particularly like data centers. We're, for instance, very close to closing out on a transaction in Latin America at the moment, which is offering very attractive yields for us in that space. So I think the statistic says that IT infrastructure, so data centers, contribute something like 4% to global greenhouse emissions. So it's definitely one of the key spaces around this transition.
Okay, we're going to give you that one. Arnaud, what are you going to be investing in?
The first one which comes to my mind would be a circular economy. There are still, we talk about new technologies and all of that, but a lot of them are applicable to avoid waste. Okay, so that would be definitely the sector, which is where you can find more quick wins and actually quicker returns. I would not certainly avoid companies, including well-established companies, because I talked about the other criteria for transitioning, which are definitely key that we have put in place, but that doesn't take out the financials. Okay, what is going to be the demand, for instance, for a certain product, the market share, the cost, to produce or to change your factory into transforming from A to B, and eventually also the pass-through. So to which extent can you pass to your margin, eventually to reduce your margin, or to your clients the additional cost that you have to produce. So you can clearly see that some companies have it, and they are the ones, in addition to the waste, so to say, subject I just touched upon. These are the two topics, the main topics and companies that we should invest in.
Zia.
See, like I said earlier, that we do invest in hydrocarbon. And what I would like to say is that sometimes when you are getting the oil and gas extracted in a more efficient manner, that's also partially green. Like, I'll give an example. We are looking at a company that is in drilling waste management system. So it actually does a closed loop mud waste management. That could be, these industries are below the radar. They are contributing to the energy efficiency, not in green. So these are the areas one can seriously look into, because let's face it, oil is going to be around for some more years. As far as the green assets are concerned, I think you have to be very careful that it should make commercial sense, because every few years you have a flavor of the month, and then when that gets over, you buy anything, eventually you have to sell it 5 years later or 10 years later. So you have to ensure that the assets are good in shape. The ESG is in place. I give more preference to G than E and S, because if G is in place, E and S follow. So it should be, the corporate governance should be in place. And if you can get hold of good assets there, just simply hang on to it. But I think a lot of opportunities are there in hydrocarbon efficiency companies.
And as Manus was saying, don't have that fear of missing out, the FOMO, oh, that's the new latest trend, I need to be investing in that. As you say, governance is increasingly coming into the play. It should always be there, because without that, lots of different things can happen, as we know.
Actually, Sarah, there are two things which we actually look for any investment we do. One is an excellent corporate governance system, that's number one. And the second is very sound management. And the third is a very, very healthy and lucrative management incentive plan. If these three things are not there, we generally don't want to invest there.
Before I come to you, Arnaud just wants to jump in on that one.
Just to react quickly, ESG is definitely very important, okay? But ESG is about the how. How do you measure? What are your policies? I think what is much more important today is to focus on the what. What is this company doing? Not contradicting what you're saying, but I'm just saying that too often we hear about ESG, but that's just a process, a policy. What is effectively done to make it happen?
So Amit at CERES.
A lot of what was said I agree with, but I would also suggest that there are lots of opportunities in the nexus of energy, water, and food systems. And if anything that you can do to look at that nexus and see where the efficiencies are, where the corporate governance is, and you can address a lot of these issues within that framework.
Brilliant, and right on time as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, up on the stage, as you can see, Zia, Arnaud, Amit, and Chiamaka, thank you so much for that insight today. Very much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Here.